Hello and welcome to Easter Eggs. I'm Scott Shuken, your host, as always. Today our topic is gaming and journalism. With me are two journalists turned developers. To the left of me, Amanda Hamon-Kunz, Hamon-Kunz, am I saying that right?
You are.
Okay, good. Who you're currently developing at Paizo right now.
Yes.
And across from me, Carlos Cabrera, and you're an indie developer.
Yes, that's correct.
Working on your own stuff?
I am.
Cool. So you both were journalists before you decided to make games. Tell us about your careers before you got here. Amanda, you can go first.
Sure. So I actually started wanting to be a game journalist back when I was in college. Before I was editor-in-chief of my college newspaper at Eastern Michigan, I was the entertainment editor, and I handled all of the coordination of all the coverage from everything from very large video game companies to Nintendo to coverage of different tabletop issues and smaller conventions and things in the area. And then I worked for various other newspapers after I graduated, and in 2009 I was working at the Indianapolis Star, and I covered Gen Con for the blog, and that was fun because that was the first time that we'd ever gotten somebody to cover Gen Con, even though it was Indianapolis. So did a lot of things, but games was always in the mix.
So you started out, you were doing journalism in college. Were you studying it?
Yeah, I have a journalism degree, so after I was at college, I worked for, like I said, the Indianapolis Star. I worked for the Ann Arbor News. I worked for the Lafayette Journal and Courier, and then I went to go work at Purdue University doing internal news coverage while I was freelancing for Paizo at the time.
Cool. Carlos, tell us about your journalism background.
I started doing journalism in 04 through 07. That was sort of my first exposure to the game industry as a whole. That was actually down in the Bay Area before I moved up this way. And I was working for a website called The Game Helper, and it's since been wrapped up in a game creation content business with my boss at the time, Joe Market, for Function 1 IT. But he is one of the founding members of the Umlaut rock band Charity for Child's Play.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So then you both were journalists who then went over to developing. Let's talk about that for a sec. How do you make that transition from writing about games to making games?
Well, I think games have always been a very large part of my life, everything from video games to tabletop games. I started playing Sega Genesis when I was in first grade, and playing games I probably shouldn't have been playing at the time, like Mortal Kombat. But I always loved video games. I always loved tabletop games. I started playing D&D when I was 15 years old. And I had my journalism degree and I had the professional experience, but I realized that it really wasn't a very well-suited long-term job for me for a lot of different reasons. I really just wasn't enjoying it. That was kind of the bottom line. And so I thought, I've got all these skills and I'm very into tabletop games. You know, probably that's pretty translatable to being able to edit, or, you know, I didn't even really understand the industry at the time, but I thought, you know, somebody might be interested in these skills. So at Gen Con, 2006, around then, I went around and talked to some publishers and sort of, you know, like had business cards and said, hey, here's my skill set, that sort of thing. And I ended up talking later on to Wes Schneider, who is the editor-in-chief of Paizo, and I met Wolfgang Bauer later on and sort of connected with them and started out freelancing, and then got lots of experience on that end and realized, hey, I should probably apply for this open job at Paizo. It was a very long journey, but it was just sort of a realization that I could do professional things. I could actually merge that with something I really enjoyed to do and turn it into a career, as opposed to, you know, something that I do only when I have time.
How about you, Carlos? How do you go from writing to making?
Well, I left the East Coast to go to San Francisco at first so I could make games. When I was
that was the plan before journalism?
Yeah, that was the plan before journalism. I was sort of just getting anything I could get my hands on in the game industry to see where I could go from there. When I was going to college on the East Coast, they actually did not yet have programs for game design at the time. So I started to do multimedia and artwork and a little bit of business and visual, the whole sort of digital package.
The closest you could find,
yeah,
really?
The closest I could find working with computers. And then I went out to San Francisco to do game design. And that's just sort of how I got my contacts out there, started doing some writing while taking classes at the same time. And then I came up here to Seattle because San Francisco is a little bit too expensive. But with just the area that you're in for game design, it was just a great place to be.
So both of you were journalists during the aughts. sounds like, to put
Yeah.
sort of a context of of the games you were writing about when you were writing. Let's talk about what it's like to be a gaming journalist. Just let's take a quick snapshot of you're a writer. You've been assigned this game to cover. How do you start? Do you play it? Do you look up reviews? What's your process?
Sure. So game journalism sort of always covered a very large spectrum of different types of coverage and articles. There were, of course, always the reviews, which for me were the most fun because that meant that I got to play through the game. And a lot of times you're on a deadline, right? So it's like, okay, I've got 12 hours total over the course of the week I can play through this game. Or you sort of have to kind of do the math to figure out how long you can play versus how long you can put together your review and write.
Any games are provided for you?
Yeah, they were. Yeah, the companies would send out review copies usually. Sometimes we would need to ask for review copies if they were a really large publisher. But most of the time, yeah, they would send it and sort of say, hey, we'd love it if you would review this game, and when it comes out, please send a link to this email, or please let us know where we can get a copy of it or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, so there's reviews, then there's sort of the issue type of coverage of journalism with games, as far as what are some of the issues that the developers are facing, what are some of the issues in the broader industry, what are some consumer-facing issues, and those are more reported from a traditional standpoint as far as contacting spokespeople and contacting sometimes the creators, but usually the spokespeople are the ones who want to talk about that and sort of getting quotes from gamers or from retailers and putting it all together into a cohesive whole. So there's a lot of different approaches that you can take, but the most fun ones are the reviews.
All right, so let's talk about reviews first then. When you're playing a game and you're going to write about it, do you start off just sort of, I'm just going to play the game, see what it's like? Are there certain things you're looking for in the beginning? How do you play a game differently when you're going to write about it?
It's more of not only how the mechanics of what the game plays, it's sort of you're delving into a little bit of the story and whether or not it's basically something fun that you would recommend to other people. Back when I was writing, I think it was very gracious for the time, but it was usually 10 full days around whatever your schedule was to play a game, get familiar with it, and then start writing up your review. After that, it would go through the editing process, but hopefully you would take enough time to actually get familiar with the product you were writing for.
So you're trying to get the whole snapshot, essentially, of
yeah, you're trying to get just the overall encompassing picture.
Are there certain things then? So then, are you just sort of playing it, and afterwards you sort of let it digest to figure out what to write? Are you taking notes the whole time on this, that, the other thing?
Yeah, I would usually take a little bit of notes when I started playing through a game at first, and then after I basically had an outline of what I wanted to write about, I would play the game a little bit more to sort of see the synergy of how the rules work together, all the metagame kind of stuff, and whether or not it was an enjoyable experience.
What about you, Amanda? What's your process like?
It was very similar. It was sort of, I would try to get as much background on the game as I could if it was a sequel to something I hadn't already played, or, if it was something that was ported over from Japan, I would try to learn about all of the background details and sort of what the game is trying to accomplish and how it had marketed itself to its audience, and sort of use those as parameters to understanding it. And then I would get into playing it and take the notes, and it's really similar to the way that you play it as just a normal consumer, although you pay a little more attention to things like why am I confused at this point, and is that just me, or is that something that the game is sort of forcing me into, or what does the game do really well that I'm really enjoying? What are some of the different choices? With a lot of games, I would have a lot of multiple save files where I would go and I would do something one way and I'd play it out, and then I'd go back and do something totally different and see if the game would let me have those different kind of outcomes to the choices. Of course, not all games are like that. But those were all sort of things that I paid attention to, and the story was a really big one. As a reviewer, I always loved a game that had a really engrossing story and that was really interesting, and maybe if the battle mechanics were a little confusing or a little clunky, I would always tend to overlook that in favor of a really cool story.
Yeah, sometimes there was sort of well, this is something they could have done a little bit differently to help improve it for consumers, but yeah, that seems to be the gist of it.
Yeah, and in my head there was always a lot of comparing as well that was this reminds me so much of Final Fantasy Tactics, or this reminds me so much of this other game that I really loved, and there's a big nostalgia factor, I think, with a lot of reviewers when there's a game that appeals to them personally.
How do you balance that then? If you're playing a game and you're like, oh, this reminds me of this, that, the other thing, but it's different in a way that is intentional because it's trying to be a different game. How do you balance your sort of desire to play this game you love and you're trying to keep an open mind about this new game? How do you balance that?
I think that's sort of a strong selling point for any new game that comes out, is that if you can give something that's familiar to your audience, but then does something a little outside of the norm, that I think gets people most excited about. That was personally my favorite ones to write.
So you said the game developers kind of want you to be able to have that tagline, like it's Halo with something else. Helps sell it.
Not so much obvious in the marketing aspect kind of things, but if it naturally feels like that when you're playing, I think that's where the big striking point for games.
You mentioned that if there are times if the story is really great, but the mechanics weren't that great, you would kind of give it a pass. Are there certain examples you could think of, or any other things where this is great in the game and this is not in the game, and how do you balance sort of like where to judge it, for lack of a better term?
I would always try to be really open, and even if there was one or two things that it felt like was rushed in development or something that could have been streamlined a little better from a mechanic standpoint, I would always include that in the review. That was like, this is a fantastic game, the story is really engrossing, these characters are really interesting. However, you should be aware that sometimes the game gets glitchy, or I got into a really big battle and it crashed. It's something like that. It's like I've got to knock down a little bit on the review as far as the rating for stuff like that, but to sort of like be able to express the nuance, I think, of the way that games are very complicated and complex systems within themselves, it is important not to just sort of gloss over things that might actually legitimately be points that you want to bring up.
Yeah, and that can be tough to do when there's ever a movie tie-in.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Because there's a very obvious deadline that you can just see from the get-go when you go in.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very few of those work out well. Yeah. We got a good question from the chat. Remember, all of you watching, of course, you can always ask questions on the chat. We can read them. We have the technology. Do you ever feel, I'm pretty certain I'm going to know the answer to this one, do you ever feel pressured to give games a good review so a developer can continue to work with you by sending you review copies? Or you're like, oh man, if I slam this game, they're not going to send me another one?
There was actually, what game was it? There was a little bit of a rough time I had doing a review like that. And my manager had to be as pleasant as he could be to say, the person writing the review is going to hand this over to somebody else because there were some difficulties, for example. But I think at the higher levels, that's always something that you're worried about. But I've always wanted to be someone who wrote things just from a very honest perspective.
Do you ever find yourself, I've definitely found myself in this scenario, I'll be recommending a game to somebody and realizing it's not that good, I just love it. Do you find yourself in that position where you're like, I want to give this game a 10 out of 10, but it deserves a 7, or you've played this franchise for so long?
I think we saw a question come up too about the numbering system and how that comes up. But I was always more than happy to give a game a 7 or an 8, being like, hey guys, you've probably seen this before, but you should really play it for, this reason or that reason. Just be very clear cut in your reviews, I think, is a really strong point to be like, well, this is someone who, when we give them a game, the person that is the company that you're getting the games from can say they followed through, they did the work, they gave this a concise article, and I think that's what probably attracts more publishers to come back to you for more, to do more reviews.
Let's get to that question that was asked on the chat by Multifractals. Do you, as previous journalists, do you think the numerical rating system should be replaced with a different system that focuses more on tastes? Do you think that the so-and-so out of 10 has a place, or do you think that we should sort of do away with it?
I think it's a fairly good system, but I think that the thing that everyone needs to remember is that 1 through 10 system needs to be focused on whatever genre that game represents. So compared to other RPGs, that should get a 1 out of 10 based upon how it performs with those similar play styles. As long as it's not an obvious take on, say, this is an action game, but I wanted it to be more of an RPG, so I'm going to give it a lower score, I think that sort of devalues the piece that you're writing.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a place for the 10 out of the 10 star ratings, but the most interesting and I think relevant reviews, or the most informative reviews, are the ones that sort of break it down. So there might be an who really want to know, should I spend my $60 on this video game? And they'll read through the whole thing and they'll sort of make their own judgments based on it. So the more information you can provide, especially in a web environment where you're not limited to column inches like you are in a print environment, that's the most useful to people. Gory, or there'll just be a narrative of what it's like to play through the game and the reviewer's experience. I think those are the most helpful reviews. Because you have a wide range of readers who are looking to just go to, a Metacritic type of thing to see, okay, what is everybody saying about this game? But then you also have people who really want to know, should I spend my $60 on this video game? And they'll read through the whole thing and they'll sort of make their own judgments based on it. So the more information you can provide, especially in a web environment where you're not limited to column inches like you are in a print environment, that's the most useful to people.
Let's touch on what you said about the genre thing, right? There are often games that package themselves, hey, look at this RPG, and it's a great action game but a weak RPG, or vice versa. In games where you can't really figure out what genre it is or what genre it's trying to be, or a game that achieves where it didn't mean to, how do you parse that? Do you ding them for not achieving what they meant to? Do you praise them for achieving something great on accident?
Some of the things I look forward to when I look at games is what potential the game had. So you can take what the designers had attempted to do, and often I would write about whether or not it was successful and basically what level of success they achieved. A lot of games nowadays a first-person shooter and an RPG.
Yep.
Exactly.
So we're seeing a lot of these
Tonight on
cross-genre
Corporate
projects come
Sins,
out. So
the team's going to the Bahamas, but disaster strikes when Mordecai forgets his sunscreen.
Where those lines
Things
meet
heat up
and
on
how
Corporate
well
Sins,
performed
brought to
together.
you by
You find
#
that's sort of
Horizon.
where the
We
10 out
know
of 10
what you
breaks down,
need.
like in a games like Borderlands. You can't necessarily compare it to Dragon Age, but you also can't compare it to Call of Duty.
Yeah, that's sort of where the 1 to 10 breaks down a little bit. So I think, I guess these sort of mid-genres that cross between the two, I think it sort of deserves their own little 1 through 10 or their own kind of grading scheme sometimes. Like it needs to be focused on just that niche.
Those are fun to review, though, because those can be a challenge, right? So depending on how your rating system works for your publication, you might actually be able to write in there that this is a game that, because it combines all of these elements in a way that they've never been combined before, that it's new. And, the developers have really achieved something and gone outside the box, or, we can really tell what they were trying to accomplish, and maybe they fell just a little bit short, but it's still a really novel idea. So I think that those are some of the most exciting games to review when it's not just an RPG or just a MOBA or just something else.
I was completely blown away by this one game I reviewed back in the day, the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, because when concept art and screenshots started coming out, it was in first person. I'm like, wait a minute, this is a storytelling tabletop RPG. How are they going to pull this off? And I actually wrote in the article, sorry guys, it's actually pretty good for what I was trying to do, because I almost wrote it off entirely. But, you go into character creation and boom, there's the character creation sheet that everybody from the tabletop RPG knows and loves. So I think they did an amazing job at integrating those two kind of things. And, sometimes you just get really surprised. They just do it really well.
Let's talk about you two personally for a second. I want to get sort of the sense of how you became gamers and how you fell in love with games. So we'll start with Amanda. You said you were playing Sega Genesis and Mortal Kombat when you were like 6.
I was. So my best friend and I, her sister was in middle school and in high school when we were really young, and so we really looked up to her, and we played all of her video games, and we thought she was just the coolest person ever, and she really is the coolest person ever if she's watching. But so that's kind of how I got in. I was playing stuff that was aged up because, of friends' siblings, and it just sort of went from there. And then I started trying to get my own systems and playing my own games, and then getting into PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. And
were you sticking to like the fighting games like Mortal Kombat? What types of games did you fall in love with when you were younger?
So I really liked like platformers and things very early on in the fighting games, and the things that you could play with your friends or take turns with different levels, like with Sonic the Hedgehog or those types of old school games. And I got into RPGs probably like late middle school, early high school, and was totally blown away because it's an entirely different system. And of course, it takes a lot of getting used to and sort of understanding how things work. But I really got into the tinkering and sort of the math element of it of, I can make a fighter who is really good with a certain kind of weapon. It can do a lot of melee damage, or I can make a mage and they really shouldn't be in melee combat because they're going to be casting spells. And, some of those early games I played like Golden Axe a little bit. But
when you discover RPG gaming, is it primarily through tabletop gaming or through video gaming?
It was probably through video gaming first because I didn't start playing D&D until I was about 15. But I sort of started, after I played D&D, I'd been playing some of the RPGs on video game consoles, and I sort of started to realize, like, wow, video games are basically just this type of system working behind the scenes. And the more I started playing D&D, the more I realized, like, I can kind of see these dice rolls happening behind the scenes.
How Knights of the Old Republic did that.
Yeah. Oh, I was a huge Knights of the Old Republic fan. I played that so many hours all the way through. But, and so it was just so much fun to be like, oh, this is really where this genre that, I am finding so compelling now got started. And I think that was what really sort of got me interested in creating the tabletop games, because you can sort of work behind the scenes to create what you're seeing, like on a video game screen, or what you're seeing at the table with people role-playing or rolling dice and having character sheets and things like that.
So you start playing tons of RPGs and tabletop gaming in high school.
Yeah.
And then from then, it's just a lost cause.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. It's not like I stopped playing other types of games, but those definitely became my favorite really early on.
You said that when you went to college, you wanted gaming journalism was something you were pursuing.
I did.
Whereas Carlos, you wanted to make games first.
Make games, right.
Why gaming journalism? Did you like to write and you liked games? You just wanted to do both?
Yeah, I think that's what it was. I always sort of considered myself a writer. I'd been doing like articles for newspapers in high school, and I always figured like that would probably be the best career for me because I'm pretty good at writing, I'm pretty good at editing, pretty good at talking to people and asking questions and getting answers. So this is what I should do. But, I really enjoy games, and games are really interesting to me. So maybe I could cover that. Maybe that would be a way to build a career without really sort of like fully being able to understand all of the different options. That's kind of where I started out.
So at a young age, you were like, gaming is going to be where I'm living somehow. Writing about it, making it.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. Carlos, how about you? Where do you begin your gaming journey?
I started off super early with my family for video games. ColecoVision and Television. It was a game system that had a circular disc for movement and a numpad like a phone.
Yeah.
Then when I was 10, I ironically played a game called Flashback: The Quest for Identity for Sega Genesis. Oh. And I'm like, okay, this is what, now I want to make games for the rest of my life.
Something about that console, man.
Yeah, and started playing D&D in high school with 2nd edition, and when I left the East Coast to go to San Francisco, I sort of fell back on the whole RPGs and character creations and writing stories to sort of basically start my writing, and that's how I sort of got into the industry at first.
So at a young age, you also decided I want to make these things.
Yes, super early.
So how early did it occur to you people made games? Like, so you guys sort of already knew from the beginning, like, oh, this is something I could do?
Not right off the bats. I knew I wanted to, but had no idea how. I didn't even realize until I was probably already in college or high school that some of my favorite games I was playing, they were just a bunch of people basically in their garages at the time learning how to program and then just making stuff. Mm-hmm. So I sort of followed the path of, going to school, going to college, and then trying to find a job because I thought that was the only way you could do it. Mm-hmm. But I was completely wrong the entire time. So now I'm actually, I'm not working out of my basement, but I'm working at home doing my own thing, and kind of that's sort of what I ended up doing.
I think I had a similar outlook in that I didn't really fully realize that I could be a game creator. I thought that you have to have connections, or you have to have, friends who are in the industry. And I grew up in Ohio and nowhere near where any of these games are being made. And so I think I thought that like my way into a professional career involving gaming was probably more to, go the journalism route. And, because I really did enjoy that professionally at first. And I don't think I realized until I started going to Gen Con and meeting some people who were creators and talking to people who were publishers and going to seminars and just listening to what the process was like, I sort of realized like, oh, this is a real job that people have, and this is probably something I'd be pretty good at, and maybe I should look into that.
Yeah, one of the things I love about just the Northwest here, going to conventions and talking to other game designers, it's just, are you working on a game? Okay, you're a game designer. Like, that's basically how easy it is just to get started. Yeah. And then you have all of these outlets with the local game stores and conventions to be like, hey, let me show you my game, and you can get feedback on it.
Northwest has always been a place where people can be just making computers and be like, hey, look at this one. And, it works, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, hopefully. It works for like 1 out of every 400, but still, it works sometimes. When you guys started writing, you guys both started writing for print?
Or digital myself, actually.
You started writing digital. You started writing for print.
I did, yes.
And then have you both written both?
I've only written digital, actually. I haven't made any print products yet, but it's just been just online, strictly speaking, for now. I'm hoping to make print, but for now, just digital.
Yeah, I did some digital. It's always been sort of rooted in print because my day job before I was a game developer was at newspapers and a university. But we sort of it was sort of the era when newspapers were experimenting with online coverage and things that they could put online and what the audience wanted. And so when I covered Gen Con in 2009, I did it via blog only. And so I would just interview as many people as I could who were in the industry and just shoot out a whole bunch of blog entries, and that way there would be a bunch of coverage on the splash page when people went to it. So yeah, I did both.
So let's start talking about print then. When you're writing for print, you're writing for a newspaper, how do you sort of find your audience, right? Writing it digitally is pretty easy because people find these things and you sort of understand that these people are going to understand the context of video games. But that's a little different for print. Yeah. And especially for a newspaper. So how do you approach that? How do you approach writing a review that's going to serve that type of audience?
Well, the great thing about games journalism is that, whether you live in Michigan or Seattle or in California or wherever, the game is still the game and it's still the same relative experience no matter where you are. And so when you're writing a review, really just sort of focusing on the game and the experience and, what it brings to the table. I think the audience sort of comes to you, especially if you're in a college environment where, kids have a limited amount of money and they want to know what games are cool. And if you're reviewing a lot of the big releases, they can sort of parse through that. And we would get a lot of responses and emails, and we would run giveaways and things like that. And the audience was very easy to sort of cultivate and build once they realized there are journalists at the paper who are doing games journalism and they're interested in what I have to say. It's a little harder for a large general print audience like an Indianapolis Star, but the web is really helpful in that sense to sort of alert people that this coverage is available so that they can follow the things that they want and give their feedback to the reporters.
So on the other side, on the web, there's a million people writing a million things. So while the paper you're trying to, there's a big audience and not that many writers. The opposite is true. There's still a big audience on the internet, but they have so many places to go to. So how do you sort of maintain, I don't want to say the integrity of your writing, but how do you approach it? Like I'm on the internet. How do you make your reviews noteworthy?
I think that just sort of being clear about what you have to say about the game in the review and breaking it out into we used to call them POEs, but they're point of entry little sidebars or the little boxes that sort of is like, this reviewer gives this game a 9.5 out of 10 and a very short little bullet pointed list of what you can find in the review, and then the review elaborates on all of that stuff. I think that sort of thing is important, and also just making sure to distribute via different channels where things are going to be available so that people from all corners of different interests can find out this newspaper is doing this stuff that I'm interested in. So it's a combination of the content of the review as far as and how it's marketed to people.
I sort of, in that vein, I think the way that you outreach to your potential readers is important, because as important as digital writing still is, I don't think you can really be like a one-trick pony if you really want to stick around in the industry for a while.
Yeah.
So the social media, perhaps maybe spreading out a little bit and potentially doing interviews and meeting people that way, I think can give yourself a boost
Yeah.
To sort of, get yourself out in the spotlight a little bit.
Yeah, I think as much as being a creator, it's important to sort of build your brand and build your personality and have people sort of know you as a creator and be interested in your work. That's also important as a game journalist as well. Sort of like making sure that you're not just a robot when you're writing your reviews and putting a little bit of personal touch on them and explaining why you liked something or why you didn't like something if it's subjective, and making appearances and doing interviews and having people feel like they're connected with you and that they want to follow you as a trusted source of games that they are interested in.
Yeah, every event I go to is not only just to have fun and play games, but also to potentially network and just sort of meet new people.
Yeah. It's personal brand and marketing and things like that. There's a lot of considerations.
That's part of your role as a writer, not just like your publisher's job to.
Even as a writer
absolutely.
too.
Yeah. And at Paizo, they encourage us to sort of build our brand and sort of emphasize that we're creators and that we're working on a joint thing, but we all have our own personal interests and our own projects that we want to do and things like that. So.
Cool. We got a question from the chat, and sorry it took so long to answer it. We have a window.
Well, I guess I'll start. I did. The idea that I had to go to high school and then college and then get a job immediately with that standard path. That's what basically everybody might tell you when you first get started, but it doesn't always work out that way. So when I left the East Coast to go to San Francisco to continue my education for game design, going to school for so many years.
Better than the other, because obviously the answer is going to be no. Find your own path.
Right.
But what you liked about your path rather.
Well, I guess I'll start. I did. The idea that I had to go to high school and then college and then get a job immediately with that standard path. That's what basically everybody might tell you when you first get started, but it doesn't always work out that way. So when I left the East Coast to go to San Francisco to continue my education for game design, going to school for so many years just gets super expensive. And because I didn't have a well-built portfolio when I came out of my college career, it was hard to actually find work right out of the gate. So that's when I basically started to do more networking, figure out what other paths in the industry that I could actually get into. It's actually gotten so much easier, at least on the software side of things, in regards to making games now. There's so many programs out there that can take a lot of the heavy lifting out of it for you. You'll probably have to learn some form of programming, even in a very small part, just to make sure the game works the way you want it to work. But there's, I think, Pixel Prospector, if I'm not wrong on that, is a great collection of just these are all of the tools that are out there today that you can get started out of it for you. You'll probably have to learn some form of programming, even in a very small part, just to make sure the game works the way you want it to work. But there's, I think, Pixel Prospector, if I'm not wrong on that, is a great collection of just these are all of the tools that are out there today that you can get started, at least for video games.
So I did have a little bit of a different path. So it was actually around 2011. I had been going to Gen Con for several years and sort of like figuring out what the industry was like. But I was working as a journalist at a newspaper in Indiana, and I sort of was at the point where I realized this is not really the career that I want for the long term. I really want to get back into games or something that's more game adjacent, because I was actually covering municipal government at the time, and so it just
not very gamey.
Yeah, it just really wasn't what I had wanted to do. So at that point, I was continuing to try to talk to publishers, and that was the year that I met Wes. And Wes was actually the first one when I approached him and said, hey, I'm a professional journalist. I've worked at all these different places, and here are the different things I like to do. I've been playing D&D, since I was 15 in other tabletop games. And he's like, I asked him, do you need any freelance editors? Because I figured that would be the easiest way to get my foot in and probably my most relevant skill. And at that time, Paizo didn't do freelance editing, but of course they did freelance design for the different types of books that they published. And he said, we don't need any freelance editors, but what would you think about design? And I said, sure, that sounds awesome. And then after I walked away, I thought, oh my gosh, can I actually do this? Because of course I had put together some material sort of on my own, but had never had any game material published. and sort of thought about it and was like, I probably could do this. I have some experience writing and definitely interested in it, and touch base with him. Got some Paizo freelance, touch base with some other third-party publishers, got some third-party freelance, worked my way into development on the third-party side, and then was a freelancer and ended up getting the full-time job at Paizo about a year ago. So it was sort of gradual, but was also kind of mundane. I mean, I definitely had to do a lot of work, but it was kind of serendipitous that happened.
There's no real big exciting moment when your story is, well, I spent several weeks trying to get a job and then I finally got it.
Yeah. It was just
but
slow process.
Yeah, it was a very slow process, and I actually, even when I was a freelancer for 3 years. I never really thought that a full-time thing would be something that would be a possibility, but here I am. I'm in Seattle.
And your story has a constant that I think has a lot of the stories of people who work in the arts in general, and gaming as absolutely a part of the arts, is that there's a lot of people asking, hey, can you do this thing? And you say, yeah. Well, the answer is probably not really. And then you figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
But that's often how it has to be done, as well as like you learned, Carlos, you also sort of already have to know how. You can't be like, hey, I want to work for you, but will you teach me first? Yeah. There's only so many places willing to do that, because you got to get those skills down. I want to ask you something that's really important to the world of journalism. Let's talk about headlines. Headlines, clickbait, where they come from and what they're doing now. What's your experience building them, working with them? Do you come up with them? Does your editor come up with them?
At the time that I was writing, things were a lot less clickbaity than they are now.
Yeah.
But
you could say that like every week or so.
Yeah. But every editor or article that went into the editors, it was more, for video games at the very least, it's very clear cut. It might be a little bit more free form for just general editorial pieces from your experience. But for most part, even now, it's just, here's a game website, here's the review on this game.
Yeah, it's just the name of the game or something.
It's just very clear cut with that. Mm-hmm. There's very little of that, I think, from the video game side of things.
Yeah. So when I was in college and was actually on the beat of covering games, it was sort of fluid in that sometimes I would suggest a headline and there would be an editor who would tweak it or who would change it. Sometimes I would just write the headline and it would go that way. And it was similar when I ended up working for professional newspapers, and I would sort of write an article and have a suggested headline, and it would depend on if it would fit, because there's a physicality involved in the paper, or what the font was going to be, or was going to be a 2-deck headline, was it just going to be a single headline, what page was it going to be on. So just because you suggest a headline doesn't mean in any world that it's going to fit into the space that they have. So there were a lot of times where the headlines would change, but they weren't, because it was print, they weren't as clickbaity as I think some of the ones that you might be referring to. There really was sort of an attempt to capture what the overall gist of it was, or if it was a review of a video game, it would be a review : and then the name of the game, and then maybe like a subhead of just a quick summary of the actual review. But yeah, I never really had an instance where something that I wrote got a headline that just totally misrepresented it.
We would talk about reviews for most of the show. Let's talk about covering issues, which is something you mentioned earlier on, how that's sort of the other gaming article that can be written is about the state of the industry in general. Mm-hmm. How do you approach that? How do you make it so you're not, lecturing the industry, if you will? How do you make it an article and not an editorial?
Well, I actually had an experience where one of your fellow developers, Owen Casey Stevens, I got an editorial piece up on his personal blog. It was sort of a highlight of my experience going from video games to sort of into the tabletop industry, since the product I'm working on kind of straddles that line. And it was just, first of all, you don't want to burn any bridges. So you don't want to call anybody out, because especially in the Northwest anyways, the networks are so closely knit. Yeah. Someone's going to hear about it. Yeah. It's going to be out there like super fast. Mm-hmm. But I was just trying to highlight my experience coming from one industry to the other, and it's sort of just a painting with broad strokes of like, this is something I've noticed in games and video games. This is how what I noticed that works in the tabletop industry, and then sort of the comparison of the two, basically. So you always want to go in there with a very... Well, you don't want to bring your personal grudges into your writing.
Stick to generalities.
Yeah, just stick to generalities and just stick to the news.
Yeah. The articles that I always wrote, the in-depth issue ones, I always sourced them as deeply as I could. And so I would interview people who worked at the game company or the spokespeople, or, you know, after doing a lot of research, asking specific questions of the folks that I could get closest to. Because, you know, there's some logistics involved. Sometimes there are policies at the company where the specific developer that you want to ask the question to, they may not be allowed to talk about the product because it might not be completely out yet, or, you know, people have a lot of different considerations. But I would talk to the people who are closest to the issues as possible. I would talk to people on the other side. I would talk to people who are actually into the games. I would get all sorts of opinions and sort of just present them as factually and dispassionately as possible. And instead of trying to prove a point or trying to lecture people, it would be more like, you know, this is like a 360 view of this issue, and this is how the developers are approaching it. This is how people from the outside are viewing it, and sort of trying to give as big of a view as possible. And I think people really appreciate when you're giving them sort of, when you're acting in good faith and you're not trying to make people look bad, and you're not trying to do a gotcha moment, and you're not trying to, take anybody's side. And I never had anybody who said that they felt like I was unfair to them, and I always took pride in that, because I think that's very important.
Yeah, I think you can definitely tell when people appreciate when you check your resources and you always cross-reference those.
Yeah, because there are a lot of articles out there that, you know, will just take one side, or they'll only interview somebody whose opinion you can tell the writer agrees with, and so it causes a lot of hubbub a lot of times. It's very clickbaity, but at the end of the day, like, it's not great journalism, and I always wanted to do good journalism.
So the integrity of your journalism is above sort of making a point?
I think so. Yeah, definitely.
Have you ever been in a scenario, and it might be more of an editorial position than a journalistic position, where you've had to write an article where you thought this point is worth making? Like you said, you don't want to call anybody out, but sometimes we need the media to call people out. That's part of why it's important for journalism to maintain its integrity. Have you ever had to do that and like had to sort of parse that barrier between criticizing something without criticizing someone?
I think a little bit. I had an experience trying to write for the local fighting game community here in the Northwest. And it wasn't well received, despite the fact that my main point of the article was, this is what I've been trying to do to help this particular niche of the industry. These are the things that are coming up. And this is sort of like the current state of things, or sort of like a state of the union for fighting games. And it wasn't well received because people didn't think that I should be writing about games, because I just didn't win any tournaments. Like, I've played these games forever, but because I didn't actually get any wins, you know, they sort of disregarded that. So that's when I had to basically step away and be like, okay, well, this is something that I'm going to be very cautious of in the future. But I didn't want to write up a follow-up piece to that after that.
Has there ever been a time or any time other than that where you found yourself thinking, either yourself thinking or other people thinking, this game, I'm not good at it, so I can't appreciate it? Because I don't think necessarily a premise that's worth granting, especially in journalism, that like you can, of course, love and enjoy a game even if you can only play it on easy mode. I can't get through Dark Souls, but I still like it.
Yeah, it's still a fun game.
So is that sort of the only time you've been in that scenario? Have you been in scenarios where you're like, is this really the thing I should be writing?
I think sometimes you were giving assignments that you weren't really excited about, but the reviews had to be made. Like if there was a AAA title that you just weren't all that interested in, your editor might have to issue the game so that the piece is properly covered, even if it wasn't something you were really excited on. And every website, I'm pretty sure, does it differently. But back when I was writing, there was at least some kind of system where you would try to throw your name in the hat for like, I want to be the one to write this new game that's about to come out. But then you have to sort of divvy up the responsibilities between all the other writers.
But in general, they still managed to avoid that.
They were pretty well at that overall, yeah.
Good. We only have a couple more minutes, so I want to talk about, you mentioned one of them earlier, but I want to hear about your favorite games that you've had to review. Not just your like the favorite game gameplay-wise, but also as far as how fun it was to write the review. Do you have any like favorite reviews that you just think back on fondly?
Wow. Wow, this is a long time ago. Do you have something that you can think of?
I think Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was really fun for me because not only did I get to do the article on RPGs, which is one of my favorite genres, but as I was going to college, I get to meet one of the designers who ended up being a teacher in one of my classes. So that was sort of like, hey, I mean, you might not have think that your game was really all that great because it tended to be a little bit glitchy in the late game, but it's like, here is a love piece I wrote for your game. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So one of the companies that we had a really good relationship with when I was working for the college newspaper is a company called Nippon Ichi. They're a fairly small publisher, but they publish games like Disgaea and all the sequels to that. And I reviewed some of those, and I think that those were probably games that maybe if we didn't have that relationship, if we didn't have like me who was super into those games, they might not have gotten reviews since they were smaller games. But I think those were always my favorite because those are so quirky and fun, and they're sprite based, but they have a great sense of humor, and there's all kinds of jokes, and so that was always a game that like I would just play through and I would enjoy the heck out of it, and then I'd write up the review and say like, all right, let's make sure this doesn't sound too fangirly.
Are there times though when you do something like that you feel like it's almost heroic, like I'm covering the game nobody else is covering?
Not necessarily. I think I was just having too much fun actually getting to do it, and also just sort of hoping that more people would, be interested in it because it's like this is a great company. They're really good to work for. They do wonderful work. They're probably going to be growing soon. So it was just a good feeling to know that that I was, participating in any sort of audience growth that they might experience, from a completely honest standpoint because the games were really good.
I've got a quick question from the chat here. Or did you have another favorite game you want to talk about?
Oh, I did get the opportunity to do a Japanese import review. It was the only website, or the only article of the kind that the website did. But I was like, okay, I'm going to get a translation of the entire menu so I know what I'm doing.
That's awesome.
And it was the first Naruto fighting game for GameCube.
Cool.
Nice.
It was super fun to play.
Well, are there any other games like that where you were just stoked to get the review copy because you wanted the game?
Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne. JRPG, but Demons Dark. And unfortunately, I never got to get to this part of the actual game for my review, but they added Dante from Devil May Cry.
Oh,
and I was like, that's awesome. I wish I could have wrote about that.
Would have been great. But at least you got to play it.
Yeah.
And somebody else paid for it. Those are the perks. So this question from the chat. Thanks, Pashy. What do you prefer, the permanence of words on paper or the immediacy and interactivity of digital? And do you agree with the premise that digital's permanent?
I think digital really is impermanent because a lot of the coverage, especially that I did like very early on, a lot of that's not up anymore, or some of it they have since sort of changed their website, and so some of the things got ported over and some of it didn't, and it's very sort of deep web stuff that's like, oh, I can kind of find a couple of the things here. So it is kind of too bad, but at the same time, like, clips are very similar when they're digital and print because the newspaper comes out and there's a newspaper every single day, and a lot of people are just not going to remember an article unless it really resonated with them, or it was, they clipped it out and it was about something that they liked, or they knew a person who was in it. So there's also sort of an impermanence to both medium, I think, but I don't know if I really prefer one or the other. I really like that there's sort of a two-way street of digital, so that is probably my preference.
Sometimes I do wish print could come back. Like the old issues of GamePro magazine where there was that cardboard model you could put together of Star Fox's ship way back in the day. So I think that the novelty is definitely something I really like about prints. But I think that the digital space can still be used in that kind of format. I mean, I think Game Informer is probably the only digital website that actually also has a magazine in the gaming space right now.
It's very hard to do from a budget
So,
standpoint.
kudos to them because they've been able to stick around for a while. But it's definitely...
It helps have a store selling your magazines all the time.
It does.
So then what do you think about the last part of his question, the interactivity of digital? Right? Do you think that the nature of the comment section that now has to be on every website that exists, do you think that helps or hinders the world of game journalism? Like, is it too many voices? Is it better we have more? Or is the trade-off just sort of worth it?
I think if One of the things that I like to get feedback on what I'm doing, and whether it's sort of, getting feedback on a game design or whether it's a piece of writing you're doing, just try to make sure that the feedback is constructive. Even if, I was just at Emerald City Comic-Con, and they're like, game designers will tear apart your design and they will not be nice to you. But that's what you want, so you know if your game's actually good. But when you're dealing with the public in the general comment section on your website, just remember, if you actually have a point to make, focus on that. But the collaboration, I think, is actually very impressive on such a massive scale.
What's your take on it?
Sure. So, what was the question again?
Do you think comments and the nature of the constant feedback that the internet gives journalism, is it helping journalism, or is there a degree to which, you're a journalist for a reason, and these people aren't?
Yeah.
Where do you think we fit on that spectrum?
So I think that it's good to know people's feedback in real time, and a lot of comments can be very constructive. I think that you just sort of need to have a thick skin and be able to separate, the wheat from the chaff, basically, and be able to tell when somebody's just grousing about something, or when somebody is just being unfair about something, or when somebody, has just made a comment that it's like, okay, that's not an entirely useful comment, or that's just a mean-spirited comment, or the moderator is probably going to delete that comment, or swear words all over the place, or something like that. So it can be really helpful as long as you sort of know how to filter some of the comments coming through, and some of the most useful feedback is often when they email you directly, where if somebody on staff says, oh, you should take a look at this comment thread because there's something that's really interesting that's coming up, because that can actually generate story ideas, and that can generate things that maybe you didn't think of but that people would like to know, or that the people are wondering, did you ask this question? And it's like, well, maybe I didn't this time, but why don't we do that again, and we'll write something else, and that will continue the conversation.
I heard some really good advice that don't listen to what they're saying, listen to what they're trying to tell you.
Yeah.
Because either feedback might not be really great, but they might still have a really good point.
Yeah, so if you can sort of read between the lines, so to speak, that's when it's the most useful.
It's a double-edged sword.
It kind of can be. Yeah.
All right, well, we are out of time for today. Are there any projects? I know that yours is still kind of secretive. We can hear about it later.
So I just opened up my business, Something Clever Games, in December.
What's the name of the company?
Something Clever Games.
Something Clever Games.
Yep. And the website will go live in July, and hopefully I'm aiming for a Kickstarter in January.
Cool. And Amanda, anything you're working on you want to tell us about?
Sure. So we just released a hardcover called Ultimate Intrigue for Pathfinder RPG. And
we being Paizo, of course.
Yes, Paizo just released a hardcover called Ultimate Intrigue. And it's got a new class called the Vigilante, which is exactly what it sounds like. You can play a vigilante, superhero, or anti-hero, and there's all the rules for that. There's all kinds of social combat systems in there. We've got
batarangs?
What's that?
They have batarangs?
We do not have batarangs. No, I believe that would that'd be getting us into a little bit of trouble.
Probably.
Yeah. But we do have some archetypes for the Vigilante, which I was able to write on a freelance basis that lets you play different tropes of different kinds of heroes in the Pathfinder RPG, which I find very exciting because I'm a big superhero nerd. So we've got that, and I'm also working on some adventures that will be coming out at Gen Con that are for folks who are just getting started into Pathfinder, and GMs that sort of would like a little bit of further instruction and things to make things interesting for players.
Cool. Well, one more time for Amanda and Carlos. I'm Scott Shuken. This has been Easter Eggs. Thanks for tuning in. Stick around for Rabbit Stew up next. It's Comic Book Day. It'll be Zach and me. Thank you guys for coming, and we'll see you next week.
Much.